Once upon a time, in a not-so-distant land, there lived an old lady called Mrs. Buttercup, Edna to her friends. She was really ancient. Some people thought she was almost 200 years old, maybe more. Others thought that she'd simply always been there, ancient but sprightly, formidable but kind. The truth was she'd lost count years ago. I hadn't the faintest idea how old she was. Perhaps she'd sit down and figure it out one of these days. Anyway, Mrs. Buttercup lived in an old tumble-down cottage in the woods by the stream. The old stone walls were covered with ivy, concealing the fading whitewash underneath. The bright blue door was held together with various pieces of scrap metal hastily bolted over the cracks. Tattered lace curtains hung in the windows, and the chimney emitted a constant plume of smoke from the fire in the hearth. The whole place was decidedly crooked, as though it were collapsing under its own weight, or from the sheer constant passage of time. Nevertheless, the old building still stood there, resolutely unshakable. It had weathered storms, droughts, floods, and even the odd tornado. That had been a terrible night. Mrs. Buttercup had laid in bed thinking that the whole roof might blow away at any moment. It hadn't, though, and the next morning she noticed that the storm had actually improved the structural integrity of the house. Mrs. Buttercup would spend her days at her writing desk, pen in hand, working slavishly at her latest book. Oh, she could sit there for hours on end, barely noticing the time passing around her. Perhaps that was how she'd lived for so long, by simply not acknowledging the clock when it chimed away another hour. Her only interruptions would be from her cat, Bella, bony and vicious, who'd occasionally ask to be let outside. Bella was feared by everyone, animals and people. Rumour has it that she'd once successfully hunted down and captured an adult wildebeest, and had dragged it back to the horrified Mrs. Buttercup as a gift. Occasionally there'd be a tentative knock at the door. It would be one of the local children, having committed some heinous act, would be sent down to Buttercup Cottage for a telling off. "If you do that again, there'll be big trouble," the parents would say. "Don't make me send you to Mrs. Buttercup." A terrified child would arrive, knock sheepishly at the door, and would wait to be admitted. "Oh, my dear, how lovely to see you. Haven't you grown? Come in and take a seat. Let me get you a slice of cake and something to drink," Mrs. Buttercup would say. She'd spoil the child rotten, plying them with food and hot cocoa, and reading them a chapter from her latest book. Even Bella the cat would muster some affection from the disgraced visitor. And after a while, Mrs. Buttercup would say, "So, what brings you down here to visit me today?" The child, mortified, would whisper her the reason, and Mrs. Buttercup would do her best to look shocked and appalled. "Really? It isn't like you to be mean to your brother like that. I'm shocked. I'm very disappointed in you," she'd say, with the faintest trace of a twinkle in her eye. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Buttercup," the child would cry. "I didn't mean to do it, and I'll never do it again, I swear." And with this, Mrs. Buttercup would pat the young reprobate tenderly on the head and send them on their way. "Now, where was I?" she'd say, returning again to her writing desk. "Oh yes, I remember." Some people in the village joked that Mrs. Buttercup's first books were carved onto stone tablets. Her most popular stories were The Misadventures of Billy Bob the Bunny Rabbit, of which she'd composed several dozen. Her seminal work, Twinkle Toes in Timbertown, had been very well received by critics and the public alike. Her seminal work, Twinkle Toes in Timbertown, had been very well received by critics and the public alike. And the recent sequel, Twinkle Toes Turns to Tramadol, had been an unexpectedly gritty and uncompromising late career hit, aimed at a generation that had grown up with the original. This hadn't been her first foray into the world of adult fiction, however. Mr. Muffet's cheeky weekend was described at the time as a horrific midlife crisis, appallingly misjudged, and enough to put off even the most hardened of perverts. She'd made a hasty return to children's literature after that. Maybe it was her age, but Mrs. Buttercup was growing weary. Sir Brian and the Knights of the Chestnut Trees had been an embarrassing flop, and Henrietta Hedgehog's first day at school had felt like a feeble self-parody, even when she was writing it. In other words, Edna was stuck in a rut. Her ideas book was down to the dregs. Something about an anthropomorphic capybara who enters a career in international relations. Awful! I can't write that. What was I thinking? She cried in despair. Maybe it was time to finally write her memoirs, she thought. Has it really come to this? The thought of writing a whole book about her life filled her with dread. All I've done is sit here writing, she thought to herself. Why would anyone want to read this? Unless... All of a sudden, Mrs. Buttercup was struck with an idea. What if I write a story about a writer who's run out of ideas? She thought. That could work. That could be interesting. After all, meta-narrative is all the rage these days, isn't it? She said, wondering exactly who she was talking to. Immediately she set to work. It would be titled Mrs. Wildwood's Struggle, a tale of an elderly witch and best-selling children's author who runs into a dry patch, losing her abilities to both write and cast spells. Once upon a time, began Mrs. Buttercup, always a solid opening, there lived a witch, as old as the hills and as wise as the trees. Is that a bit self-indulgent? She wondered. That's fine, she continued. Her name was Mrs. Wildwood, as you probably gathered from the title of the book. The intellectuals will appreciate that one, she thought. She lived in an old tumble-down cottage, not unlike the one I'm currently sat in. No, that's too much, she thought, crossing it out. There's meta, and then there's just talking about yourself. It's a fine line to tread. Anyway, onwards. Mrs. Wildwood was a witch, but the good kind, mind. She was a pillar of the local community, perhaps a little taken for granted, but nevertheless a beloved figure about town. She would spend her days making potions to cure all manner of ailments and afflictions, and it'd always be a local who'd get into an accident and need her powers to fix a broken bone or two. In other words, she was always busy. And when she wasn't rubbing herbal liquid on sprained ankles, or saving cats from trees, Mrs. Wildwood was a celebrated children's author. She'd had more bestsellers than some people had had hot meals. In fact, some considered Mrs. Wildwood the voice of a generation. Now that really is self-indulgent, Mrs. Buttercup thought. But lately Mrs. Wildwood had been stuck for ideas. Her cauldron of possibilities had dried up. A series of short stories about a talking rhinoceros who trains as a warlock. That's a terrible idea, Mrs. Wildwood shuddered. I can't possibly write that. Mrs. Wildwood thought long and hard for ideas. She tried to think of an animal she hadn't already made a lead character of. She thought about professions that she hadn't yet put in the spotlight. She thought about experiences she might draw on. I've got it, said Mrs. Wildwood. I could write a book about a best-selling children's author who runs out of ideas. It was a truly brilliant conceit. Perfect, thought Mrs. Buttercup. I can churn out 10,000 words of this, and that gives me a whole month or so to think of some better ideas.